Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. My name is Bronwyn Williams. I'm just your host this evening. I'm not very important, or this morning, as I said, depending on where in the world you are. Today we had to talk to Oliver Traldi about his new book about questioning our political beliefs, which is, of course, a topic that just can't get enough discussion, certainly on the internet and in most other parts of the world too. So without further ado, just a bit of housekeeping. This is an Intellect salon. If you're not a member, if you haven't signed up, go take a look at the website. There's plenty more of these where this come from. If you are interested in this sort of a thing, interested in having conversations with interesting people online. Secondly, because this is kind of a book review, a bit of a super salon, you will see it is being recorded. If that affects the questions that you ask or your willingness to be seen on screen, then go ahead and adjust your settings. But otherwise, we're very grateful that you're all here. This is not supposed to be a podcast or a lecture, and we are certainly looking forward to your contribution to the conversation. So if you've got any questions for Oliver or for the room or for the group, go ahead and ask them. If you're feeling a little bit shy, you're of course most welcome to pop any comments or questions into the chat too, and we will get to it. But to start off the session, I think it's a good idea to get Oliver to introduce himself and tell us a bit about the book that he's put together and why he wrote it. And let's take things from there.
Hi, my name is Oliver. Right now I work at Princeton University as a postdoctoral researcher. Up until last year, I was a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. And this book came out of a course that I taught there. I don't remember whether I thought about writing the book first or teaching the course first, but it was sort of, they were sort of developed in tandem in a way. Basically, my interest in the topic of political beliefs, both from a sort of perspective, you guys might know me from my sort of magazine writing. So both from the kind of popular and from the academic perspective, began with the 2016 election. So the election of Donald Trump saw a lot of discussion of things like fake news, alternative facts, conspiracy theories, polarization, ideologies, echo chambers, filter bubbles, social media bubbles, and all of these things were, in a sense, were epistemological ideas or social epistemological ideas. And it just so happened that this election also happened around when I decided to go back to graduate school. I had been in law school for a year following college. I did a classics major, and then I went to law school for a year and then went up the street to do a master's degree in philosophy. But I hadn't really thought about epistemology very much. And I sort of got a little lost in metaphysics and then left and then wasn't really doing very much for a few years. And so this newfound interest in epistemology brought me back to philosophy. And it turned out that a lot of philosophers were already writing about these topics, but in a way that I felt was really disorganized and was not for popular consumption, and often baked in a lot of the politics into the epistemology. So in general, there's two ways of doing epistemology, which if anybody knows G.E. Moore's response to Descartes about skepticism, you'll be familiar with these ways. One of them is to say, well, I'm going to remove everything I think I know and sort of try to start from scratch. And the other one is to say, well, look, I've got my hands, I've got the table, I already know what I know, and let's just sort of, cross the T's and dot the I's. That's okay. I'm being a little harsh on Moore, but so it felt like a lot of the political epistemology and political psychology and the political science that's related to epistemology was in the sort of latter vein, where people took it for granted that they already knew a lot about politics and that it was easy to know a lot about politics. And I sort of went, I was sort of more interested in the first approach. Maybe, maybe I'm missing something. I was raised very progressive. I voted for Democrats my whole life, and I started thinking maybe there's something going wrong here. Maybe something more left wing or more right wing than me is correct. Maybe there's a lot that I'm taking for granted. And so I sort of dove into this literature, and I found that nothing really good in general had been written on it, and no good general course had been taught on it. Among other problems, there's writing on it from the ancient world, from the modern world, from political psychology, from political science, from the critical theory tradition, from the Marxist tradition. And then you have people like Cass Sunstein, who I think I saw do a salon here a few weeks ago, and Steven Pinker writing about it, who are very, very modern thinkers and sometimes even so you have the popular and the academic. So I wrote this book as a, I say that it's half textbook, half treatise, because it has a lot of my own opinions, but it also is meant to be comprehensive in terms of the topics that are relevant to political beliefs, and in the last section, in the sort of phenomena that are super relevant to political beliefs in America right now, like polarization and conspiracy theories and things like that. So that's sort of the genesis of the book, and yeah, what it comprises.
Well, it was quite a big topic that you decided to take on there. And of course, you started in true philosophical style with interrogating the meaning of the words behind belief and politics and political. So maybe you want to unpack that a little bit about what you came up with, what your conclusions were when it came to defining the terms of engagement.
Yeah, so I think part of my But part of my interest in defining the term political belief had to do with my experience in arguing about politics, especially online, and where the real flashpoints in political debate are. I saw political debates often as a series of these news events that were then staging grounds for different groups to figure out who was being reliable and who could be trusted and who was dangerous, right? So everything from the murder of George Floyd, or the Jussie Smollett hate crime hoax, or James Damore getting fired, COVID, and COVID policies, school closures, now questions about, for instance, here at Princeton right now, everybody probably knows there are protests on college campuses right now, and the protesters occupied a building, Clio Hall, and there's a sort of he said, she said thing about were the protesters like really mean and scary to the staff that worked in this building. And it turns out that actually that is the core issue of can we trust the protesters to be good community members or not? Because that is the one time when they really went overboard. And there's a claim that they really went very overboard, and then they claim that they didn't, right? And so if you think about that, that is not a lot of the time when people talk about political beliefs, that they're talking about, what is my belief about taxes or about abortion or about gun control, some political issue. And what I've seen in political debates is that a lot of it is about these flashpoints, and about, which groups can be trusted, and how does this news story kind of shake out, and which side behaved well and which side behaved badly. So I decided we needed a more comprehensive idea of what a political belief is. And so I ended up defining, there aren't really, politics is a term that is debated obviously in many areas of philosophy and political science, but without a really satisfying resolution. And belief is also a term that's debated really much more within epistemology. But one of the things that was interesting to me is that everybody agrees that beliefs have some relationship to actions. So, if I believe that it's raining, that makes it rational for me to get my umbrella, or if I believe that it might rain, right? But if I don't have any such belief, then it would be very strange for me to get my umbrella. And so I decided that the right way to think about political beliefs, well, it's sort of a two-pronged approach. One is that they're the beliefs that separate out these groups, right? I was talking about these political groups are vying for space and vying for trust. Is it's a belief that, is sort of like a flag that's planted in the ground, where one group is on one side of the belief, the other group is the other. And the other prong is if it's the sort of belief that is related to political actions in the right way. I'll let somebody else define which actions are political. In the same way that, my umbrella is related to that believing that it's raining is related to getting my umbrella. It looks like we have a few questions, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah, Josh, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure the protocol. I didn't want to interrupt while you're talking, but So when you were describing the Columbia protest, or the protest in general, I suppose, you sounded somewhat like you're confused, or we should be confused by what's going on in terms of people's response, like people trying to fit the narrative. But it seems to me that doesn't that almost undermine the whole concept here? Because clearly what's happening is people take their beliefs and try to make the facts fit them rather than making their beliefs fit the facts.
Yeah, so there's definitely, so this is one of the background debates that was in the air when I started writing this book. Basically the debate over what you might call political rationalism versus political irrationalism. So it sounds like what you're describing is what's sometimes called motivated reasoning or confirmation bias or my side bias, where we have some preference about how the world would be, or we have some sort of, picture in our head already of how the world is. And we just sort of, the evidence against it, we just sort of try to push away. And I think that certainly happens in politics. But and I go into this in the book, there are some questions about just when this is rational and when it's irrational. And there are also questions about how often people do it and whether there are conditions under which we can help people not do it. So one reason to think that it's less irrational than it might sometimes seem is just the simple Bayesian notion that when we get new evidence, we don't simply get rid of our old ideas, right? We do some kind of complicated updating procedure, right? So if I believe that, and I very professionally do not take a side about the protests. I make snarky comments, but I don't take a side. But let's say I would believe that the protesters were really a force for good and were really good people and they would never hurt a fly. And then somebody says, well, they treated me horribly when they came into the building. It's not clear that it's rational for me to just say, oh, well, I completely believe you that they treated you horribly, and so I'm going to get rid of my old opinion. Actually, probably what's rational is to say, well, I had a pretty high confidence level in my old belief, and I don't know you that well, so it's gonna move the needle a bit, but I'm gonna remain, I'm gonna maintain a certain level of confidence in my old belief, right? So if what confirmation bias in some cases is just sticking with our old beliefs in the face of new evidence, that's often rational because our old beliefs are often also based on evidence, right? And there could be more evidence that they were based on than the new piece of evidence that we get. So there's a lot of these debates about when these biases are rational and irrational. Certainly, that's not to say, certainly when you talk to people about politics, you can have a visceral sense of irrationality. And I do think that that's what a lot of people are responding to when they talk about irrationality in politics. But I also think, I think it's important to not go too far with that. More broadly, there's a rationalism irrationalism debate in the background, which is not about politics at all, and it's about human cognition in general. So I don't know if you know about there's this heuristics and biases research program, which is the Kahneman and Tversky program. It was related to their book Thinking Fast and Slow. This was a very popular research program in psychology that led to this explosion of we're biased in this way, we're biased in that way. And it turned out that some of this research held up and some of it didn't do great in the replication crisis. And there were also theoretical challenges to it from people like Gerd Gigerenzer and from some philosophers. And there were also sort of competing models offered. So one question is, where the notion is called bounded rationality. So the notion is we're bounded, we're limited people. And maybe using heuristics sometimes is the best we can do, right? So there's a question of what sense of rationality should we be working with when we talk about human cognition? In epistemology, that's called the ideal non-ideal theory debate. So, okay, I just threw a lot of stuff out there. hopefully some of it responded to your question.
Adrian, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I'd be fascinated to know how your book cuts on a kind of an equivocation around the idea of what a political belief is. And actually, while you were talking, I got hold of the PDF of chapter 3 and tried to skim it, but I thought you're just there, so maybe I'll ask you. And I guess it's this, that it sounds like you're talking about one type, which is that the political salience of certain sorts of empirical matters. So people might say something, oh, the reason I'm so cross about what Israel are doing or what the Hamas are doing is because of what I believe happened on October the 7th, for example, or what I believe happened around the murder of George Floyd, or any January the 6th, any number of these flashpoints. And I guess they could be political beliefs in that they're politically salient, and there could be some interesting epistemological questions there, because it could be that humans behave really badly, or there's all sorts of epistemic hazards for how we set out working out what to believe of when we do this, which I think is probably certainly true. And then I guess the other way there could be an interesting epistemology of political belief is how one comes by one's core principles and preferences. I don't know, if you take something like the different construals of what matters or what's at stake in egalitarianism, equality of what, right? So when people make those claims, if there is any kind of moral knowledge, then clearly there's the potential for failures of knowledge, and therefore there's an epistemology to be done there. But if people say, look, I think what matters here is like the notion of equity, whereby you kind of it's not exactly that you're after equality of outcome, but you look for any possible barriers which could be implicated in inequality of outcome, and you set about removing those. Or you're a hardcore libertarian and you say, look, just everyone has these basic rights, and that's what matters. And both of those are kind of beliefs. So did your book cover both of those things? And because they could seem quite clearly distinct, the empirical stuff and how one comes to believe what's right and right about what's right.
Yeah, so I do take it that both, what might be called facts and values, or both moral beliefs and non-moral beliefs can be political beliefs. I do think that there's a little bit of, so I have a kind of discussion question in one of the early chapters about this. I'm not sure that I'm completely happy. So I think under my definition, any foundational belief about ethics will come out as political. And I'm not sure that I'm completely happy with that. So I think there's probably work to be done on this definition. Hopefully, one thing in academia is sometimes it can actually be more profitable to mess something up, because then, maybe somebody will write like a response article and cite me, and then there will be a whole literature about, defining political belief, that if I had done it right the first time, I wouldn't get so many citations. But that's a little bit of inside baseball. But yeah, I do think that this, and yeah, so just to kind of completely agree with you, really, there are different epistemological issues that come in the moral and non-moral realms. And it's something that I sort of wish I had gotten into a little bit more, moral epistemology, but moral epistemology is really, it can be a little difficult in its own right. And there was already a lot in the book. The place where I get into a little bit, and I've done this in my public writing as well, there's a chapter on expertise where I talk about what would be a good notion of political expertise. Is political expertise possible? And I made the point that final political expertise about what should be done in politics will require, again, just by Hume is ought gap, right, will require normative and non-normative premises. And so you have to resolve the issue of whether there are normative or moral experts in order to resolve the issue of whether they're political experts. There are a lot of challenges to the notion that there are moral experts of various types. I mean, some philosophers just say the notion of taking anybody's word for it when it comes to morality is fishy. They use the word fishy. I don't know if I completely agree with that. I feel like there are people who I trust to sort of be better and have better judgment than me. And I think a lot of people have that, especially people in religious traditions will trust their priests and rabbis and things like that. I'm pretty secular myself. And then there are also these issues of in expertise in general, there are these issues about how does a novice recognize an expert without already knowing the subject matter. And that's especially, it's especially difficult with morality because there's no, you don't get outside confirmation that, if somebody says it's going to rain, then you see whether or not it rains, right? If somebody says this action is wrong and you do it, nothing happens except maybe, when you die and go to hell or whatever. But there are sort of ways around that too. So you might have sort of post-action regret, or you might think about it for a few weeks and realize that person was right, and then realize, well, they got it right away and it took me a few weeks. But yeah, I think the moral versus non-moral belief question is really important. And there are, early on in the book as well, one of my favorite parts, and one of the parts that I think is more of sort of an original contribution than some other parts of the book. I lay out like a few different ways that the political conflict can arise. And certainly disagreements over facts and disagreements over values are two of the ways that political conflicts can arise. And we might think of those as very different kinds of conflicts, and we might think of them as requiring different kinds of, different kinds of responses. So if some other, if we're at war with somebody and we think it's because they didn't understand some academic paper, then maybe we should stop the war and explain the paper to them. But if we're at war with somebody and we think it's because they hate the very notion of freedom and equality, then maybe we just need to win the war, So yeah, it's a very important distinction, and I don't think I've done it justice quite yet.
Before we get to Anna, there was a question in the chat that was asking about how you determined the boundary conditions of what a political debate or question is, and how that in turn affects questions about political beliefs.
Yeah, good question. It's funny, I thought it was really important to define what a political belief is before going into the rest of the book, but the truth is I don't actually build off of that definition too much, and I don't actually go back to that first section too much. And it's something that once I finished the book, I sort of wondered whether I should have done it more, or whether it was sort of a failure of organization or structure on my part. But yeah, the truth is that it doesn't actually play a huge role. The definition of political doesn't actually play a huge role in the rest of the book. I do think it gives a sense of the way that I think about politics and sort of my emotional, in my personal life, I can be very conflict avoidant. Politics to me is just like it's like this awful fact of the inevitability of conflict in life, is sort of what politics always reminds me of. But then again, I'm always participating in conflicts. So the fact that I mainly think that politics is about conflict and that this comes out in the first chapter, I think in a way just brings out, in a sense, my own ambivalence about the issue, which I do think remains throughout the rest of the book. So more at an artistic than a philosophical level.
Absolutely. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that, the distinction between sort of moral facts and facts that you kind of got into a little bit in the beginning part of the book, which is quite interesting. But let's get to Anna first, and then I can interrogate you further, my own interest.
Thank you so much. And hi, Oliver. So great to meet you off Twitter. Okay, when I raised my hand, I had one question, and now I have two, because you kind of like dragged something out, and when it got interesting, you moved on, and I'm like, let's go back there. How does a novice recognize an expert without knowing the subject matter? So it sounds like a map and territory problem, but for epistemology, I'm intrigued. And the other is, who are these original people that you mentioned?
Oh, sorry, I don't remember saying the phrase "original people." And also
you said some contributions. You said that you mentioned people in the book, but you deem one part of this group more original than the other. So I'm very curious who are the original contributors to the field of political belief that you like.
Yeah, sorry, I got a little confused about, I don't remember exactly what I was saying there. But it's also, I should say, it's very nice to meet you off of Twitter as well. We correspond a lot on Twitter, and this is the first time we've actually spoken. The first question was about the novice expert problem, right? So this is just a very hard problem in what we call social epistemology. It comes up in politics, and I think is very important socially because of debates about credentialism. This is one of those weird areas where, you know, academic philosophers are talking about experts, and then cultural commentators are talking about credentialism, but somehow the philosophers are not cultured enough to actually take part in the broader conversation. And sometimes the truth is sometimes are a little bit just of the expert class themselves, and just take it for granted that, you know, oh, if somebody says they're an expert in misinformation, then we'll just trust them about, you know, so this idea of trusting the experts. So the novice expert problem, just to go over it again really briefly, is basically the notion that to identify an expert requires being able to judge that they're getting issues right. But if you can tell when they're getting things right and wrong, then you yourself are the expert, right? If you already know what's right and wrong in their field. So the challenge is, say you're a novice and you don't know what's right and wrong in this field. How do you decide who to trust? And how do you decide who's the expert? It's not an intractable problem. So if we think about things like going to the dentist or doctor, or calling a plumber, or you know, deciding who to listen to about political beliefs or something like that, you know, why are people here? Who knows? Maybe it's because you trust interintellect, you know, and you trust them to have good sorting mechanisms. Maybe it's because I have a bunch of Twitter followers and you trust Twitter. That's probably not reliable. Maybe it's because I have a PhD. That's probably not very reliable either. Maybe it's because I wrote a book with Routledge. That's definitely not reliable. But so there are these ways, there are these heuristics that we use where we say, well, this person is an expert. They've been deemed an expert, maybe through these social channels. There are, in some fields, you'll have track records. So how do you know somebody is an expert pilot? Well, if they've flown a lot of planes and haven't crashed any, that's probably a good sign. Didn't mean to get, I know there's a thing going on with Boeing right now. I didn't mean to get into that. You guys, I'm sure you guys know more about Boeing than I do. But when there's a track record, especially a track record of sort of accomplishment, rather, you know, what's called knowledge how rather than knowledge that, that's something that you can point to. You know, if you think about places where it's obvious who the expert is, things like sports, well, people just compete at, you know, you can just see who's fastest, you know, you can just time them. That's the fastest racer is the fastest racer, right? And yeah, I mentioned meteorology before. That's something where things are very reliable. One of the things about politics is that the actual political world is so complex. And it's not clear that there are people who are experts in sort of the whole of it, right? There are experts in economics, there are experts in sociology, there are experts in political behavior and in electoral politics. It's very hard sometimes to fit it all together. And so finding political experts can be very difficult. Then you also, so one thing people have talked about is experts within a field disagreeing, and that certainly happens. You know, people can have PhDs from the same institution and have exactly the opposite views. The other thing that I've thought about a lot that I don't think many other people
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
So, but do you see, is it the novice's responsibility to decide or be able to check if this dentist is registered, has high ratings, etc., or is it the in the broader sense, is it whose responsibility is it to verify the level of expertise? Is it the experts to prove, to communicate, to always be right, to hide previous opinions that were proven to be wrong or that are not that didn't get replicated? Who is at fault when this relationship falls apart?
I guess I would say probably both parties. But what I would say is that even if the expert is the one at fault, the novice will still sort of be screwed over. You know, and so thinking of ourselves often in the position of novices in this very complex world, you know, the notion that well, it's not my fault. They had a degree on the wall and I trusted them. That's not gonna get your teeth back or whatever, right? And so this is a question that, it's a question that is as much a question about our personal practical rationality as it is a question about morality, right? If that makes sense.
I also thought that came through quite strongly in your book. Like there was the difference between those problems that have a fact that we can get to, and those sort of actual challenges that we have, differences in values, in morals, in opinions. And I just wanted to pull up one of the quotes from the book that I thought also adds another layer to this that I found really interesting. And that was when you said, there's another way in which expert disagreement might mean that trusting the expert leaves us no better off than we started. If we are hesitant to trust ourselves with the responsibility of forming our political beliefs or moral stances, because we suspect we have various cognitive biases that might affect our thinking or our values, then we ought to be at least a little hesitant to trust ourselves to identify experts and pick among disagreeing experts ones that will help ourselves, right? There's that whole sort of sense of when it comes to moral problems, you kind of have to figure out these things for yourself. You can't rely on deferring to an expert for an intractable solution.
Yeah, that's certainly right. And I think when I was writing that, or at least now that I'm hearing it, it sounds good when you say it out loud. I often think about, before I started writing my own articles, the way that I would share other people's articles. And I would share them in this way that I would just sort of skim them, see that I agreed with them, see that they would sort of piss off people who I wanted to piss off, and then share them on social media, right? I think a lot of my own articles are probably shared that way. And so the search for, the search for a source, the search for an expert, the search for, well, here's somebody who makes the opposite argument and look at how cool they are, right? Often that is not like, it's not done in complete earnest, right? It's not done from this position of, oh, I don't actually know anything. It's done from this position of, well, I have the same biases in looking for the expert that I would if I just came up with my own view, right? So in that sense, it's sort of like we don't really do any better by finding an expert, because we're just finding the experts who disagree with, who agree with what we already think, right? And in a sense, that's the other side of the novice expert problem, right? Where, either you admit that you're a novice and it's hard to figure out who the experts are, or you don't admit that you're a novice and you just find people who already agree with everything you agree with, everything you already think.
Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I'm going to get to one of the comments in the chat that picked up on one of the topics that I've certainly found interesting when I was going through the text. And that's a comment from Josh, who's asking, why don't philosophers like prediction markets anymore? Because it's a topic that you do actually happen to address with quite a good helping of humor and insight.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Personally, I love prediction markets, and this is another, I didn't talk about this, but this is another part of how I got into writing about political beliefs. I actually completely forget sometimes that this happened, but in 2016, during the Trump election, I made about 10 grand on PredictIt, on my own political prediction account, and managing some other people's accounts and doing some weird shenanigans where there was guaranteed money in some markets because the markets weren't rationalized, and there was sort of guaranteed arbitrage. There were guaranteed arbitrages in certain markets. And then there were markets that were just very silly. I would bet in like elections in Argentina and stuff like that. Just because if the prices are fluctuating in the right way, you can just guarantee that you'll make money. And So, my experience with political prediction markets was that they weren't completely rational, because if you have a guaranteed arbitrage, then they just can't be, it just can't be rational. It can't be a rational market that, it's free money means that it's not rational, right? But at the same time, I did feel that the markets were getting something that was missing in the public conversation. And I often felt that they reacted to things before other people. One of the best examples of that was Brexit. I didn't bet on Brexit. I just arbitraged, which was, I made a few $100s, which was nice. But as but to predict what was happening, I was just watching the markets change. And I was at dinner with my family, and then I was on a date after that. And at both times I said, Brexit is going to pass. And people looked at me like I was crazy. And I was just like, well, look at how the betting is going. And they said, well, what's the polling look like? And I said, I don't need that. They have the polling, right? So the social epistemology of markets, if you trust other people, then there's a sense in which that means you should trust the market. In the book, I talk about, so I think it was Adrian who talked about facts and values, who talked about moral and non-moral beliefs. So one thing that I talk a little bit about, this is a place where that comes up, Robin Hansen's discussion of prediction markets and futarchy is sensitive to the fact-value distinction. So he says, obviously, we cannot bet on moral beliefs. Let's say I place a bet that murder is wrong. When do I win that bet? When I get to the pearly gates or something, right? Then I don't care anymore. So Hansen thinks we should vote on values and bet on beliefs, and he has a whole complex system, which I'm not sure that I did justice to in the book, but there was a lot to talk about. So yeah, personally, I really like prediction markets. I wrote a little bit about the theory of prediction markets in maybe 2018 in Quillette, maybe it was in this article on there was an academic cancellation somewhere in the Pacific Northwest of a guy named Bruce Gilley, who had written an article called The Case for Colonialism. I think for some reason I just decided to mention prediction markets in this article. And what was interesting to me at the time about prediction markets that I bring up in the book is that in a prediction market, you know, in a sense, you're rewarded for having an unpopular opinion, right? Because you get to express it at a much lower cost. You get to express your opinion at a much lower cost. And at the time, when I was just starting to think about academic freedom and free speech and cancel culture and wokeness, or whatever we call it back then, this was really interesting to me. The notion that it would be cheaper to express an unpopular opinion, when in most of life it's more expensive to express an unpopular opinion, right? And that was really the feature of prediction markets and markets in general that stuck with me. That made them seem not just efficient, but in some sense like virtuous. That it's a place where you're encouraged to go against the herd and to go against the consensus.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because that was also one of the comments you made in the book that I thought was quite interesting in terms of your personal opinion, which you did put as a caveat as such, that when it comes to social credit or social currency, as I speak in the most figurative terms, of political beliefs, there's a sort of norm and consensus that having conservative or mainstream views gives you the higher social credit or currency. But your take was that actually having a slightly contrary take actually gives you more social credit and currency in the real world. So I'm interested in how you sort of square that with your comments you made just now on prediction markets.
Yeah, so I think I probably made that comment, if I remember correctly, I made that comment when I was talking about the system justification theory of political belief, and the second part when I was talking about psychological theories of political belief. I think, in terms of the real world, I think it just obviously depends where you are and who you're around. But I think I was probably trying to do a little bit of a gotcha. But I think it's obvious that in academic psychology, which is where system justification theory came from, system justification theory is the theory that said you're rewarded for expressing conservative beliefs and for sticking with the status quo and remaining mainstream. It just seemed obvious to me that in academic psychology, there's plenty of rewards for going against the mainstream, for saying that the mainstream is somehow horrible. I probably overstated it a little bit there because I probably got on a little bit of a roll in that section. But yeah, I think it really depends. You know, it really depends on your context, and that's, you know, that's something right now I'm working at a sort of conservative enclave within Princeton. So compared to Princeton as a whole, I'm conservative, and within a conservative enclave, I am not conservative in my politics, economics, philosophy, lifestyle, you know, so you watch for, you know, you watch for different things in different contexts, and everybody does, you know, I'm describing something that people do naturally and that I'm sure all of you do in the different contexts of your own life. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely like currency in being slightly contrarian, but not too much, right? You gotta always sort of balance that. But before you like move off the topic of prediction markets altogether, there was another comment you made that I thought was really interesting in terms of the work that I'm doing. We're certainly looking a lot at youth voter apathy with our elections coming up. I'm based in South Africa, for those of you who don't know, but we know our youth voter apathy is a global challenge too. And I was interested in the comment that you made around the dilemma for both prediction markets and democracy at large. The sort of more settled the science seems to be, the less of those arbitrage opportunities that you mentioned, the less of the chance of the individual action to actually shift the needle, the less sort of participation you get in those markets. They kind of become more clogged or almost full of cholesterol, if you will. And I wondered what your thoughts are on that in terms of maybe an antidote to some of the political sort of discourse and polarization that you started off trying to address, but also perhaps the other end of the scale as to when there's not enough political polarization and not enough disagreement, that's also quite a problem for society, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's this dilemma that I identify in a few different places about what happens if you trust an aggregative mechanism for political belief. So this could be democracy, it could be, you know, it could be people voting, it could be prediction markets, it could be tradition. I talked about that in the last chapter of the book. And the dilemma is, well, these function by sort of aggregating a lot of people's independent judgments. So if you keep your judgment independent and sort of add it to the mix, you're helping out, right? You're doing your part. On the other hand, if you feel that the aggregation mechanism is reliable, then in a sense, what's rational to do is not maintain your independent judgment and to simply go with what the mechanism spits out, right? What the majority vote is, or what the market share is, or something like that. So there's a sense in which, like, you have to have a kind of double vision to both be rational and to help out the rationality of the mechanism, if that makes sense. So that's the dilemma. And that's not a dilemma it's a kind of dilemma that we encounter a lot in theories of rationality, where once you have a notion of group rationality and a notion of individual rationality, there's a question of how they translate. So a lot of irrational people can make a rational group, and a lot of rational people can make an irrational group, depending on how we define group rationality. Now, there was another part of your question, which was about apathy. So certainly apathy is a difficult problem. We certainly have it here in the United States as well. With, you know, we talk about people are way too into politics, they're fighting in the streets, and then, you know, most people don't actually even vote. So there's that, right? I do think that by its very nature, political apathy, it's hard to figure out what the causes are, because the apathetic people don't express, you know, they don't come to us, you know, they don't want to take surveys, they don't want to vote, right? They don't want to express their political opinions. So I think that if I had to guess, I would say, at least in the US, I think there's fewer apathetic people who believe, oh, I don't need to think about it because I can trust the government. You know, I don't need to think about it. I don't need to deal with that. I think in the US, the more common apathetic view is like, well, everybody involved in the whole politics scam is so corrupt that I'm just not even going to touch it. So I think that the apathetic people, my sense is, are usually not apathetic because they trust the system. I think often they're apathetic for the opposite reason. But again, it's hard to know, and an empirical political scientist might know better about that than I would.
Yeah, or maybe you can come back to that in terms of how it maps to political beliefs in a second, but let's go back to Adrian, or Adrian. How do people pronounce your name just before I mispronounce?
Adrian, yeah. Although I guess my surname would trick people into thinking otherwise, but yeah, no, I'm English. A question for Oliver. Are you familiar with the theorist Michael Frieden, who's done a fair amount of work on liberalism? He's not really a political philosopher. He's a sort of a kind of a professor of politics in general, more of a sociologist than a.
Yeah, the name is familiar, but I don't think I've read him.
So he's written some good. I think he's retired now. He's written some good stuff on liberalism. His big idea, or the sort of his signal thing, really is an idea called decontestation, and he's applying a sort of an ideological analysis to political philosophies. He says one of the things that ideologies try to do is to try and establish their construal of what's at stake morally. I guess if you take the idea of essentially contested concepts,
mm-hmm.
and the example we gave of equality earlier, what's at stake in various ideas about egalitarianism. One of the ways that ideologies proceed is to try to decontest essentially contested concepts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is probably true if you look at how people argue, but I wonder if it's very definitely true now, or truer now, with regard to the sorts of political beliefs that you're focusing on, which is when, and particularly this idea around expertise, when people think that a bunch of politically salient empirical matters are really, really salient, which is that they might decide the questions entirely. That's one way you might set about decontestation right now. You might say, for example, look, I don't know, immigration, right? That really the way we work out the rights and wrongs of immigration is looking at its impact on GDP or various, quantitatively tractable measures of, I don't know, social cohesion or social prospering or these sorts of things. And when that becomes true, I think something like it probably has become true. If you think about utilitarianism sets up all these sort of downstream empirical domains that it says, look, we just need to work everything out.
Yeah.
Really. Work out how we get happiness. And really it's something for the economists to do. But if that becomes true and decontestation moves into that realm, where the way you kind of shut your opponents up is going, look, we did a survey or we ran the numbers. That would seem to set up a real hazard around those epistemological endeavors which attempt to be neutral, because there's lots of new reasons to be suspicious of them.
Yeah, sorry. I think I got lost a little at the end. At first, I thought you were asking about, once we set up empirical measures, we can sort of be technocrats and we can remove some of the contestation and conflict from politics.
Yeah, no, you probably I waffled. That's probably why you got lost.
But you're saying maybe there's a danger in that as well.
Well, I guess yes. That if you take Michael Frieden's idea, that one thing ideologies and ideologists or ideologically motivated people do is they go about this business of decontestation, right? And one of the ways they do it these days is they try to go, well, look, let's get into the facts business, settle the facts, and then we'll definitely win, right? If that's how ideological decontestation is showing up now, that's giving us an extra reason. That might be why people are distrusting what once would have been knowledge-producing institutions, because we kind of know that empirical matters have become extra politically salient, because some people claim they just carry the day, and that might make us even more suspicious of what once would have been kind of value-neutral epistemic enterprises.
Yeah, no, I do think that's actually a really interesting notion that I'm not sure I've thought about or even heard before. So it could be that, so it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a possibility that there's a sort of false technocracy, in the sense that on the surface, everybody accepts the notion that these matters are going to be settled empirically, but actually they still maintain their, they maintain all their political commitments. And so they're just going to have the same fights will happen over the empirical debates as would have happened over the value debates in a different setting. So basically we have the same contests in technocracy, and we just sort of pretend they're about the empirics. Is that the sort of notion that you're talking about?
Yes, although I wouldn't, it might not just be people. I mean, I guess the institutions could go a little bit awry as well.
Yeah.
Through things like funding and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think that's very interesting. And I do think it's very likely that things like that happen. In general, there's this other debate that came out. People are always having this debate. One of the times that happened recently was with Steven Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature. A lot of the meta debate about that book was about, can we really measure what's measurable? Can we measure what's important, right? And both the right-wing and left-wing critics of Pinker, Pinker is one of these people who, he'll post these charts like, look at how many people are reading, fewer people are dying in childbirth, fewer people are getting sick. Even though we had this horrible COVID and these horrible wars, there's actually less death now than there was, blah, blah, blah. And I'm usually pretty convinced by that, but there's a lot of people who say, well, what about the stuff that we can't measure? What about the stuff that we can't make a target? So I think, there's a lot going on in the question of technocracy. And I do think this question of what is the source of political conflict? Is it facts? Is it values? Is it, in the book I talk about pure political conflict, where there's not even really a disagreement. It's just like two people want things, the same thing, and they're going to fight over it, right? And like Marxists think most politics is like that, and sort of like Machiavellian and Hobbesian realists maybe, and IR realists, international relations theory of realism thinks that politics is like that. And I do think what a lot of those people think is that, and they don't even talk about values, they don't even advert to values. They say it's all this pure conflict, and both the values and the empirical stuff are just ways of, of obscuring or mythologizing the core. This is like, I'm speaking as a Marxist here, but they'll say, like all the science, all the morality, all the religion, this is all just papering over the class conflict, which is the actual fundamental fact of politics, right? So I think the question of it should be a question that people have: in what ways does one sort of conflict masquerade as another type of conflict, and things like that. So I think you're completely right. This is something to watch for when we think about doing politics empirically and when we think about technocracy.
Anyone else have a question? Otherwise, again, I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah. Sure. I have a question. Going back to actually something you said right at the beginning in response to one of my questions about updating, basically that what appears to be irrationality is actually just like Bayesian, updating your Bayesian priors. And you talked about, you basically describe humans as bounded rationality. And I'm sort of curious if I can sell you on maybe how I think of it, which is more of bounded irrationality, which is that, if you model people as, maximally tribalist, but like but the amount of irrationality we're willing to express is bounded. When you get punched in the face, eventually, you lose your tribal affiliation and you're like, this is not working. And that is a better model for like, explaining like academia and explaining things where like people seem to be ignoring the facts until it just becomes overwhelmingly evident that like, I mean, it's almost like the structure of scientific revolutions or something.
Yeah. So I actually think this is what you're saying does fit my own experience and what I've talked about with other people, especially in these political epiphanies that people have sometimes where they say, well, I was super woke and then this happened, or I was a Trumper, but then I realized I was this, and then I was this, and then I realized I was that. Everybody's always having these conversion, the zeal of the converted, right? And it's, who is it that said this thing about whatever, probably history. They say, how does it happen? It happens gradually and then all at once, right? And I think that's what you're describing, where people do seem to hit this threshold. It's a lot more of a threshold experience, the way you're expressing it, when it comes to actual humans, than it is one of gradually shifting your priors, where people, it does seem like what actually happens in the real world is that people sort of ignore, and then they just hit something that they can't ignore. And then all the things they were trying to ignore sort of come, then they hit you. I don't know if anybody has had this experience. Probably nobody represses their emotions here, right? Probably just me. But sometimes you have this experience, if you're, if there's an emotion you're trying not to feel, and then, maybe a few little things make you angry, but you say, oh, they're just little things. I'm not going to be angry. I'm not an angry person. I'm not a mean person, right? Then there's something that's big enough that you just can't help being angry. And then actually you're like way more angry than you should be, because you have all these little things that it's sort of built up, right? That were just, being bottled up, right? So I do think that there can be a sort of, this is another, you guys are giving me such great ideas. I mean, you guys should write a book too. There's this sort of epistemological bottling up that happens, where these insights that we have, that we haven't let ourselves update on them. And then there's something that we just can't help. We just can't ignore. And then there's all these other, we're like, oh, sort of, you might call them like the red flags, if we were in relationship land, they would be the red flags, right? So yeah, there's all these red flags, and you're like, oh, all those red flags. And that's part of why you get the zeal of the converted, I think, because you get shifted way, too much onto the other side. So yeah, I think that's completely right. And I do, in terms of my, I try to balance my, I'm just a fly on the wall observing things, but I'm also trying to be within the academic literature, and I'm trying to be in conversation with historical philosophers. But in terms of my cultural observations, it does seem like things happen in that way, where you hit a threshold, and then it's sort of like this avalanche of pushing you all the way down into this new set of views about how things are going. And you have these epiphanies.
Let's go to Anna and then George.
Thanks so much. Again, I have two questions. I only had one when I raised my hand, and things keep happening. So the first one is, I'm constantly fascinated, as the leader of an organization that once was called post-political by Tyler Cowen. I remain fascinated by being what it means to be. Are we post-political? Are we post-secular? What do these words mean? I deeply think that people equals politics equals people, and so if there are new kinds of people, there is a new kind of politics. It just doesn't have a name, right? But I really like to say that, the First World War didn't know it was First World War. Every historical era is pre-something. In retrospect, we are pre-something, we just don't know what. And so in 50 years, people will be writing books about our era of intellectual orphans, as I like to call ourselves, and it will be completely obvious in retrospect what we were, right? In the big picture, we don't know. But this also kind of raises the question to me of like, how do the political beliefs form? How do the political beliefs form? Is it a negative thing? Is it like a knee-jerk reaction that arises from tribalism, anger, maybe guilt over our privileges? Or is it something that comes from more positive sentiments? And so I would love to hear, not just Oliver's, but the group's take on this. I mean, we come together from different places in the world. Maybe we have very different lived experience about this that we're happy to share. And the other thing is kind of an aside to go back to the Pinker book and the whole idea, and whether, Oliver, you think that something might become more measurable these days with technological advancement, that or maybe more rigorous academic norms that we could not measure in terms of well-being, social stability, maybe 15, 20 years ago. So one is the formation of political ideas, whether positive or negative in your opinion and the group's opinion, and the other is anything becomes measurable that didn't used to be.
Yeah, so I'll take on the second question, and maybe hope that other people weigh in on the first question. But regarding the second question, Yeah, I definitely think that new tools can make things measurable, but I do think that, I was very influenced by and this comes out in my chapter on expertise and also in the second part of my book when I talk about political psychology. I was very, very influenced by the replication crisis in social psychology. And I learned about it during my master's program, but just thought about it intellectually, and only a few years later started thinking about it politically. And one, I think we should be tentative about new tools that claim to measure things. And in the book, I talk in the chapter on personality theories of political beliefs, I talk about this a little bit when it comes to these scales of fascism, or these scales of, conservative personalities or racial resentment and things like that. And people find these correlations and they say, well,
Big
you're
five and things like that.
Yeah. And they say like, well,
Openness.
you're a Gemini, so of course you're a socialist or whatever. And then it turns out that how do they measure you're a Gemini? They measure it by asking whether you're a socialist. It's not quite that bad, but there are these things. It's called content overlap, this sort of phenomenon.
Hang on, I have to call somebody.
So yeah, I think things become newly measurable through human ingenuity, but we need to be careful about our tools. And I think that's one of the lessons of the replication crisis. But I would love to hear other people's answers to the first question, where they think their political beliefs came from.
Anyone? You can pop your answers in the chat too, but let's also get to George, who's been waiting for a while.
Hey, Oliver. In political science, there's a distinction that I think I found useful between distributive and redistributive politics. Distributive politics being something which is less politically conflict, and redistributive having more. And professionally, I found, so there's a whole lot of work. I think people who aren't professionally involved in politics, most politics is distributive, right? And so there's a lot of political decisions that are made that really aren't that conflictual. It makes me wonder.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Can you lay out the distributive redistributive distinction?
Right. So basically the idea is if you have stuff to give out, stuff broadly defined, you don't upset people by differentially giving stuff out, because you're not taking anything away from anyone. Redistributive means I am actually going to take something from someone else and distribute it to another person. And it's those redistribution events that really tend to lead to a much higher level of political conflict. Typically in the political science literature, this is done really in the sort of budget fiscal questions. I'm going to tax this person to take the money to give to someone else. So I am going to cut this program to give to someone else. And there's a rich literature in this. If your program and your agency is in the wrong subcommittee, they're going to take the money from NASA and they're going to give it to the EPA or something like that. What I'm wondering is maybe one way to think about the conflict we're seeing now is really not redistribution of fiscal goods, but redistribution of normative goods. We are taking away normative good things and making them bad, and now making something new, redistributing this norm to somewhere else. So I'm just kind of wondering if, like, how does that I'm trying to think about, because again, I just see huge amounts of political decisions that are made without conflict, and yet now we see this expansion into these new realms of highly conflictual decision making.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm losing steam a little bit here. So I was thinking about your notion of redistributing moral goods. This is actually something I was talking about yesterday so here's a slightly different context. It's not the distribution context, but something where I think there's a similar relationship between the moral and the economic realms. I was talking about yesterday on another podcast the connection I see between what happened, I graduated college in 2008, right into the financial crisis. And the connection that I saw between that and some of what I felt were the problems with, what's sometimes called the Great Awakening or the progressivism of the 2010s. So one thing that I felt one reaction that I thought people had in common was you would have these people who would say, well, I did everything right. I did everything society told me to. And now look at the position I'm in, right? So you could go to all the right schools, and then sort of be screwed over in terms of your job in the financial crisis. And you could sort of, do everything you were taught to do morally. And then suddenly there's a new moral system, which says that you were an awful person for doing all of that. So there is a connection that I see there between the moral and the economic realms. One of my reactions, again, I don't think this is quite answering your question, but one of my reactions to the redistribution question, just from the perspective of what we were talking about, the background debate about political rationality and irrationality, I do wonder whether this would be called a sort of irrational asymmetry, but by some writers, because if the consequences are the same, people end up with the same amount in the distributive method or the redistributive method. It might look irrational for people to reject the one case. Yeah, I think a lot of people, for instance, it's always more pleasant to have your or at least for me, maybe some people feel the opposite, but for me, it's always more pleasant to have my taxes automatically deducted from my paycheck rather than taking this huge hit whenever I pay them. But it's the same money in the end, right? So you might think that this is an irrational way of doing things. So yeah, those are my reactions. I don't think I completely answered your question, but I was sort of riffing on it to an extent.
If you want to jump in and clarify that at all, you're most welcome, George. If anyone else has got any questions?
Yeah, no, I was just like, again, I was just sort of a notion that had crossed my mind as far as like this, because I'm intrigued by this idea. People tend to think that politics is always full of conflict, and my experience has been that there's actually a lot of politics that happens that's not really particularly conflictual. It's gamesmanship, but it isn't really conflict as much, and that's just why I wanted to throw that out there.
Oh yeah, sorry, right, yeah. Sorry, like I said, we're getting near the end of this, and I'm fading a little bit. So I think that one thing to say is that there's a question about when the politics happens, right? So I think redistribution, what you're saying is that redistribution is much more likely to cause conflict than a distributive policy. But in terms of setting up the policy, I think that likely for it to seem like a highly political setup, the process of coming up with the policy likely means that it was highly conflictual, sort of originally coming up with it. Now that's not, that's an empirical question. But I think it's likely that whenever the policy was set out, there were different stakeholders who had different opinions about, what the right policy would be. And maybe the distributive policy, yeah, maybe it's a better public policy because it leads to less conflict. But the sort of original political situation is the one where that decision is being made, right? And I actually think likely, this is a very core, coming up with like a tax policy is a very core political situation. So it has all three elements that I talk about in the book, as well as the fourth element that I'm sort of thinking about, which is that these days I think that politics has to do with being in the right sort of community. That there are some communities that are of the right size and structure to be political communities. which I think is Aristotelian. He talks about polis, but I haven't worked that out yet. In the book, I talk about power, conflict, and order. So setting up a tax policy likely involves resolving conflict, likely involves, using power or somebody winning power to set the policy, and obviously making the policy involves setting things in order. So I think this is a pretty core, this probably has at least some elements of all three of the aspects of politics that we talk about. And that's the way most of the things, when we think about politics, most of the things that we think about as political will have at least some elements of all three of those things. That's why they're the three candidate definitions. They're the three sort of natural things for people to come up with. I'm sorry that I took a little while to process that question. I zoning in and out to a small extent.
We'll be gentle. It's hard to keep this going for so long, but you're doing really well. I had a question that perhaps was slightly related to what we've been speaking about, or perhaps not at all. And that was going back towards the beginning of your book again, and your critique on some of the expert science or social science, if they kind of the same thing, on the definitions around the conservative mindset being associated with the dark triad personalities. And it just comes back to some of the comments you made about being a liberal in a conservative corner of a very liberal institution, and how you came up with your ideas around that, which is a notion that is floated around quite a lot.
Yeah, so I think, my sense of how the academic literature goes is so, again, we were talking about the novice expert problem before. I'm sure everybody has done this. As you engage with an academic literature or a news source or something like that, you develop this vague sense of vibes around how does it work, what is incentivized within it, what does it tend to produce. And talking to people who researched this, talking to people who didn't like the research in this, I developed the sense around the political psychology of conservatism literature that it had a few different sorts of flaws. Even the less aggressive parts, I thought, had a few different sorts of flaws. I was very influenced by, I think it was an article on Heterodox Academy. I forget the author, but I'm pretty sure I cited it in the book, talking about the big five associations with liberalism and conservatives. And so openness to experience had always been associated with liberalism. And that was one thing I hadn't really doubted. I'd been like, well, yeah, this is what sets me apart as a liberal, even if I, don't really like some liberal candidates or some liberal policies. I still have this broadly liberal worldview where I love trying new cuisines and I like going to the opera and stuff like that. And this author was this Hispanic guy who grew up in a rural area and said, where I grew up, being open to experience meant like sometimes you'll just walk out and look up at the stars, because those are the experiences that you have. And it turned out the big five personality assessments didn't have, all the big five personality assessments for openness to experience, or a lot of them were related to maybe some of the experiences you might have in cities, which are liberal coded rather than conservative coded, or that you might have if you're sort of a cosmopolitan with enough money to travel, which is going to be well coded in a certain way. So there was a question about these assessments, and it's always funny because in a way it's like the IQ tests and standardized tests are always attacked for being culturally biased and things like that, and they go through this intense psychometric, they're just trying to remove this bias constantly. It's like the main thing they're trying to do with standardized tests and IQ tests. And then these other measures come along, and there doesn't appear to be, and these are just cited as science, and none of the skepticism is attached to them, but actually they exhibit much more of these problems. But I think the most obvious ones were things like, well, so for example, in Adorno worked, the Frankfurt School philosopher Theodor Adorno, and critical social theorist, was one of the co-authors in this book, The Authoritarian Personality, which had this thing called the F scale for fascism. So this is one of the early attempts to explain political beliefs through personality. And, they said we found these correlations between being high on the personality of fascism and support for authoritarian regimes. So the personality explains the political beliefs. And it just turned out, and they said that there were associations with social conservatism, but it just turned out that some of the questions were just straight up like asking about socially conservative policies. So of course you're going to find a correlation because you're just asking directly about those things, right? And the same thing happened recently with these racial resentment scales, where social scientists would say, well, we found heavy correlations between high racial resentment and conservatism. And then but in the questions, they would just ask about, social policy that liberals and conservatives disagree about. So, being against, affirmative action, or being against being against higher taxes might be viewed as racial resentment, when actually what that's measuring is just conservatism to begin with. So, it's hard to say that we have a correlation when we're actually just measuring the thing that we claim it to be correlated with to begin with. So I think there's a lot of questions about, when have you actually found a personality construct? I mean, what even is a personality? That's something a philosopher can talk about, right? But there's a lot of questions about, when do we have a valid kind of personality construct, and what do we have to do to really show that there's a correlation? One of the most, sorry, I'm babbling a bit, but one of the funniest things that happened in the replication crisis was, there was this paper about conservatives are more likely to be psychopaths than liberals. And this was widely, there was all this, all these little, there wasn't, not long articles, but, in the New York Times, they found it's like so funny, conservatives, they're psychopaths. So it turned out in this paper, there had been a sign error. So a sign error is when you have a plus instead of a minus, or vice versa, instead of a certain quantity. And the quantity was either the psychopathy or the conservative liberal. So it just turned out that the paper showed that liberals were more likely to be psychopaths than conservatives, and it just had been completely reversed by this small error. So yeah, I think for a lot of reasons, I just have a lot of skepticism about the constructs, about the measurements, about the rigor in the field, about the political priors of people in the field. And in general, it's sort of, it's like, it's just like going to a restaurant where you're like, I ate there. Sometimes it's good, but sometimes it's not so good. And you're just like, well, maybe I just, I'll get my sushi somewhere else,
Adrian, and then Ravi. And then I think we will have time for maybe one or two more questions. If you want to get a question in, get your hand up, so poor Oliver can have a break after being put on the spot for an hour and a half.
Yeah, you've made me think of another way in which the replication crisis might blow back on technocracy. Because one of the justifications of technocracy is that that we have available to us these rigorous methodologies for knowledge production, which tell against common sense, so they can produce counterintuitive truths, which are useful for working out how we govern things. But interestingly, one of the things I spotted, now I'm going to talk about a study here, and this one may not have replicated either. We may have a sort of meta replication crisis going on. But one of the things I remember being said about the replication crisis is that like a bunch of normal people, non-experts, who are better at predicting which studies wouldn't replicate. And one of the explanations for why this might be so is that one of the factors, one of the motive forces of the replication crisis is there's this kind of wonky incentive system and signal boosting for quirky counterintuitive stuff, right? So you're going to get a paper published, you're going to get grants and all that sort of thing. More people are going to read it and cite it if you're saying, actually everyone's some kind of weird bastard and we're always trying to trick each other the whole time. And even when people say they're good, they're bad, or whatever it is, something like that, right? And this produces the incentive structure to produce these weird counterintuitive results, but it's wrong. And ordinary people or non-experts aren't gulled by this. They just think, well, it doesn't seem to be the case. That could blow back horribly on technocracy, because if one of the things technocracy says is, no, look, you shouldn't go with your instincts. You shouldn't go with common sense on this. We find out that unusual things are true about redistributive schema and mechanisms and that sort of thing. I don't see that. I mean, that strikes me as being quite like it. I don't see it being entertained or appreciated by our technocratic classes.
Yeah, so just in general, I completely agree. I mean, so many great comments today. Like really, a whole more books could be written just from some of the cool ideas you guys are throwing out here. In terms of common sense, I 100% agree. I don't know if that did replicate. I know that there were questions about what replicated in the meta replications, and that's on all the replication blogs. But that's beyond, like, I can't keep track at a certain point. My favorite blog about the replication crisis, which I assigned when I taught this class, they were like, what even, you know, it was, I don't know, I should have taught like 5 classes to get them to this level, but is by Daniel, it's Daniel Lakins or Andrew Gelman, one of the replication-y bloggers, but it's about the Hungry Judges study. It's called Impossibly Hungry Judges. So I don't know if people know the Hungry Judges study. This is a study in Israel that showed, you know, up until lunch, judges approached like 2/3 conviction rates, and then right after lunch, judges stopped convicting anybody. So lunch was really important, a really important factor in whether judges convicted people or not. And Daniel Lakins wrote a blog post, I think it was Daniel Lakins, where he just said, use your noggin, you know, use some common sense. Think about the results of the study. Think about what would have to be true if this were true, right? So Lakin, one of the great phrases, he said, you know, we would have, if lunch were this important, then our entire society would be organized around lunch. I mean, my day is organized around lunch, but, you know, our entire society, you would never even think about, you know, asking somebody out before lunch, or like everything would happen right after, everything important would happen right after lunch because people are so agreeable and happy right after lunch. So it basically said, there's no way you should reject this just because the effects are not this large. You know, nothing is this big. There are no tricks. There are no shortcuts, you know, and especially not without some background psychological theory. So whenever you have this, and I've gotten into arguments about this on Twitter, but basically there is this notion, and I think, you know, it's not just because of the heuristics and biases research program. I think a lot of it dates back to, you know, our models for what is so good in modern science are, you know, like relativity and quantum physics, where we just say the world just doesn't work. It doesn't work the way that it looks, you know? And I think a lot of people are looking for, whatever your field, you're looking for, oh, how does the world actually work? How does it actually work? What is the hidden? And I think one thing to say is that, like, most of the time, if you find what you think is something hidden that nobody has seen before, it means you're hallucinating. And you should really check that. So yeah, I think we need to use our common sense with evaluating psychological findings, or at the very least, they need to be fit into some larger theory. If there is some counterintuitive result, it needs to be something that can be made sense of in the context of some theory that has other support. But just, you know, just finding out of the blue, lunch is the most important, you know, social, you know, event in human life, can't be. We have to check that. You know, we have to have some skepticism about that.
I mean, food is good, but some people have big breakfasts too, right? So there you go. Ravi, do you want to go ahead? I think that'll be our last question for today, unless someone else has got a really burning point they want to jump in with.
Yeah, I was curious about, this is kind of touching on some of the recent threads of the discussion. You were talking about how the skepticism of these kind of psychological identity correlations, and I was just wondering what you find are maybe fruitful ways of looking at the correlation between psychology and identity and the beliefs, if not the correlations that you were pointing out, because I think it is a phenomenon that we all observe, that identity and political beliefs sometimes go together. And there's this phrase on the internet, the type of guy. You can kind of observe this way that identity and somebody's beliefs kind of go together in this seamless package, and maybe kind of literary ways of looking at it are fruitful, but I was wondering if there are philosophical or empirical ways of thinking about it that you find useful.
Yeah, so I definitely know this sorts of, again, just putting off my philosopher hat and taking on my like lay person cultural observer hat, I definitely am familiar with the sorts of correlations you're talking about. On the other hand, the other observation I feel that I've made is that it feels to me like every political group that is successful has every type of guy in it. And maybe that's maybe that has something to do with my view of like, I view in the end, I'm sort of like a very soft liberal type where I think all different types of guys need to coexist and that we form this sort of like symphony, like you need the oboe, you need the flute, you need the cello, whatever. But so for example, the libertarian economist is like a similar type of guy to the communist who like read like a ton of theory and applies that, like they have very different views of the world in some sense, but the way that they relate to other people, the way that they relate to, having a lot of knowledge and dishing it out and things like that can be very similar. So that's my impression, at least, is that there are probably patterns, and there are probably correlations. Another thing to say is that whenever there are these correlations, you have to ask whether they're cross-cultural or not. One of the difficulties in, and I touched on this near the end of the book. One of the difficulties in saying that there are correlations with liberalism and conservatism is that over time, liberalism and conservatism change. And what is the liberal position now is not what it was 30 years ago. What is the conservative position now is not what it was 30 years ago. So you have to ask the question of, does being a certain type of guy mean going along with the liberal position, whatever it is, or does it mean going along with what the liberal positions are now? It does seem as though, so there's this book called the True Believers, I think, or The True Believer by maybe Eric Hoffer or something like that. So if that's the type of guy, the True Believer, maybe that's something that will be a true believer in any social movement. And that could be a left-wing social movement or a right-wing social movement. Could be a left-wing now, left-wing 100 years ago, left-wing 100 years from now, which could mean very different things. But yeah, I think the one thing that being in conservative circles has sort of made me think about a lot more is like the malleability of the notions of left and right, the sort of historical contingency of liberalism and conservatism. William F. Buckley said, the conservative is the person who stands athwart history and yells stop. But that's actually like a highly relativist notion, actually, right? Because history is just wherever we are now. So it's not actually, it's a very funnily non-principled notion of conservatism. So yeah, I suspect that there are these correlations. But yeah, I think there's every type of guy everywhere. And there remain questions about like what exactly is the correlation to and what causes it. It could be that, if the liberals control academia and the conservatives control business, then people who would be in academia will end up liberal and people who would be in business end up conservative. But then if that were to switch somehow, there's a question about, would the types of guys switch from liberal to conservative, or would they switch from academia to business, or what, right? So I don't know. To me, I think the observation of the types of guys, I think, can be really telling, but it's just a snapshot, right? And so it's hard to know how many conclusions we can draw from it. And Anna's certainly right about men versus women, since we were using the type of guy. Women are a type of guy. Yeah, and an interesting thing about women is what happens when women give birth. Generally become more conservative as well. And I think there's interesting questions about that. Another, one thing that's been true throughout history is the urban-rural. That's not just a current thing. cities tend to be more liberal, and that's been true since ancient times, I think. I don't know what the best explanation of that is either.
The women thing's really interesting when you look at falling birth rates across the world and all the rest of it. But thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of our time. I know you've got things to get back to. Thank you so much for being so generous. And for those of you who have not yet got a hold of a copy of the book that we've been discussing, most of these ideas, not all of them, there's some new ones in here in this conversation today too, but most of the ideas that started the conversation are in the book. Would definitely encourage you to read it. Oliver, where can people get hold of it? And where can they get hold of you if you want to be gotten hold of?
I would love by this group, I would love to be gotten hold of. Anybody can hold me whenever they want. I can be found on Twitter. And if you go into my name, Oliver Traldi, and if you go into my bio and click the first link, that will be the book, and it's free online via open access. And the paper copies will ship in about a week, I believe, if you want to splurge, if you want to spend what I think is an objectionably high price, but if you want to buy it, they will be available in about a week.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming along and for participating. It was a